January 1943. The ruins of Stalingrad lie silent, beneath a sky the color of iron. Snow drifts through the shattered windows of what was once a worker's apartment block, settling on frozen bricks and the bodies of men who never left their posts. Somewhere in the distance, a single artillery shell echoes across the Volga, but there is no reply. The Sixth Army can no longer answer. Inside a collapsed basement near the city center, German soldiers huddle against the cold, wrapped in tattered blankets and strips of cloth torn from their uniforms. Their breath hangs in the air like smoke. They whisper about hunger, about home, and about a breakout that never came. Above them, Soviet patrols move carefully through the rubble, rifles raised, knowing the last pockets of resistance are weakening by the hour. 3 months earlier, these same streets were filled with confidence, the belief that the city would fall and the war in the East would tilt forever in Germany's favor. But one decision, made far from the front lines, had already determined their fate. And to understand how that decision was made, the story must return to the months before the winter closed in. In the summer of 1942, Germany stood at the height of its territorial expansion. The Wehrmacht had swept across the Soviet Union the previous year, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and advancing deeper into the East than any invading force in history. Yet despite these vast gains, the strategic picture for Adolf Hitler was far from satisfying. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Its armies, though battered, continued to reform, retreat, and resist. And with each passing month, the German war machine grew more stretched across a front so enormous it defied logic. That summer, Hitler decided the key to breaking the Soviets lay not in capturing Moscow, but in seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Operation Blau, the grand 1942 offensive, aimed to cut the Soviet Union off from the energy that fueled its armies and factories. Without oil from the Caucasus, Hitler believed, Stalin's forces would collapse within months. But another city stood on the path to that objective, one Hitler viewed not only as a logistical crossing point, but as a symbol he could not ignore: Stalingrad. Stalingrad's location on the west bank of the Volga River made it a critical artery for Soviet transport. Grain, oil, and raw materials from the south moved northward through that channel. But more importantly for Hitler, the city bore Stalin's name. Its capture would be a blow to Soviet morale and a demonstration to the world that Germany's advance was unstoppable. It was this mixture of strategy and symbolism that gradually pulled the Wehrmacht toward a battle it was not prepared to fight. By August 1942, Army Group B pushed toward the Volga, its columns moving through endless fields of dust, scorched villages, and retreating Soviet units. The Luftwaffe pounded Stalingrad relentlessly, turning entire districts into smoking ruins. These bombing raids killed tens of thousands of civilians and created the very terrain that would later trap the Sixth Army in close-quarter combat. Still, from the German perspective, progress seemed steady. The Red Army appeared to be withdrawing in disarray, unable to mount a coordinated defense. But unseen to the Germans, the Soviet High Command was preparing something far more deliberate. While frontline units fell back into the city, General Vasily Chukov and his 62nd Army strengthened defensive positions inside the ruins. They dug in behind factories, apartment blocks, and trenches carved from rubble. Their mission was simple: hold the city at any cost, delay the Germans for as long as possible, and wait for the moment when the Soviet counterstrike could begin. In September, the 1st German infantry divisions reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. They expected a rapid collapse. Instead, they found a battlefield unlike anything in modern warfare: a maze of twisted steel, collapsed roofs, underground passages, and fortified strongholds. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, a description that captured the chaos of men fighting room to room, floor to floor, often within meters of each other. The battle that followed drained the Sixth Army of manpower, ammunition, and time. Every advance was paid for in blood. Yet Hitler insisted the city must fall, even as his forces grew increasingly exhausted. And while German attention remained fixed on the brutal struggle inside the ruins, the Soviets quietly gathered reserves on the open steppe north and south of the city. The decision that would cost Germany the battle was still months away, but the conditions that would make it irreversible were already forming around Stalingrad, like the first strands of a trapdoor as September turned to October. The fight for Stalingrad shifted from rapid German gains to a grinding, methodical struggle for every street and structure. The city's factories, the Red October steelworks, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant, became fortresses defended by small Soviet units who refused to surrender even when surrounded. German troops, accustomed to sweeping maneuvers across open terrain, found themselves locked in close combat that drained their strength and eroded their momentum. The 62nd Army, under General Vasily Zhukov, understood the stakes with brutal clarity. If they yielded the west bank of the Volga, the Germans could cut Soviet logistical lines and potentially collapse the southern front. Zhukov ordered his soldiers to remain close enough to the enemy to grab their belts, a tactic designed to reduce the effectiveness of German artillery and airstrikes. By forcing constant proximity, the Soviets neutralized the German advantage in firepower. The battle became a contest of endurance, a relentless exchange of grenades, rifle shots, bayonet thrusts, and hand-to-hand encounters inside the ruins. Meanwhile, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was beginning to feel the limits of its own capacity. Supply convoys struggled to keep pace with the extensive front lines created by Operation Blau. Fuel shortages slowed armored units. Ammunition stocks dwindled as each block required sustained bombardment to clear defenders. Food became scarcer, and the daily grind inside Stalingrad produced casualties faster than reinforcements could arrive. Yet despite these signs of strain, Hitler's directives remained unchanged. Stalingrad had to be captured. Retreat was not an option. Instead of consolidating positions and securing the flanks, German forces continued funneling manpower into the city, convinced that one final push would break Soviet resistance. Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring reassured Hitler that air supply routes could maintain the Sixth Army's needs, a promise that would later prove disastrously unrealistic. Outside the city, however, an entirely different battle was taking shape. Hidden by Soviet deception tactics, large Red Army formations gradually massed on the northern and southern approaches to Stalingrad. These sectors were defended not by elite German units, but by Romanian armies lacking adequate anti-tank weapons and heavy equipment. Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky understood that these flanks were the key to their counteroffensive. If they could break through the Axis allies protecting the shoulders of the German advance, they could encircle the Sixth Army inside Stalingrad itself. Throughout October, German intelligence failed to grasp the scale of the threat. Reports of Soviet troop movements were dismissed or interpreted as attempts to relieve pressure inside the city. Paulus focused entirely on capturing Stalingrad, continued sending divisions into the urban maze, further weakening the outer perimeter. The Soviet plan, Operation Uranus, depended on this very fixation. Every day the Germans fought deeper into the city. The trap tightened. By early November, the situation reached a delicate balance. The Sixth Army controlled most of Stalingrad's western districts, but the Volga crossings remained in Soviet hands. The Red Army funneled reinforcements across the river under constant fire, sustaining the city's defense. German forces were exhausted, their ranks thinned, their heavy weapons worn down by continuous use. Temperatures dropped, and winter began, biting through thin uniforms never intended for prolonged exposure to the Russian cold. Still, the Germans believed victory was near. Street by street, building by building, they claimed more ground, unaware that the greatest danger no longer lay in front of them but far beyond the city limits. The conditions for a decisive turning point were in place. What remained was the moment when every choice would narrow into one fatal decision. At the heart of the Battle of Stalingrad stood a clash of leadership philosophies that shaped every decision made on the ground. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, was known for his methodical, cautious approach. He excelled at planning and logistics, but he lacked the instinct for bold improvisation that had characterized earlier German victories. His strength, precision, became a liability in a battle that demanded flexibility under pressure. Above him, Adolf Hitler exerted increasing direct control over battlefield decisions. By late 1942, Hitler saw himself not merely as a political leader, but as the supreme strategist of the war. His growing mistrust of his generals drove him to involve himself in operational matters with iron rigidity. In his mind, holding Stalingrad was not simply a military objective, but a matter of prestige and ideological pride. He issued explicit orders forbidding retreat, declaring that the Sixth Army must stand fast regardless of circumstances. Paulus was bound by this command structure. His personal caution made him reluctant to challenge Hitler directly, even when evidence mounted that the situation was deteriorating. Reports from the front warned of weakening flanks, Soviet troop concentrations, and declining supplies, yet Paulus hesitated to take independent action. His staff officers urged him to prepare contingency plans, but those suggestions dissolved beneath the weight of Hitler's directives. This dynamic, a rigid leader, far from the battlefield, and a cautious commander, unable to assert autonomy, formed the foundation of the decision that would ultimately doom the Sixth Army. Stalingrad was not a battlefield suited to German doctrine. Blitzkrieg relied on rapid movement, combined arms coordination, and overwhelming firepower. But inside the city, mobility vanished. Tanks struggled to maneuver through rubble. Artillery fire demolished what remained of the city structure, but could not dislodge embedded Soviet defenders who operated from cellars, sewer systems, and hidden trenches. The German army, designed for operational maneuver warfare, found itself trapped in close-quarter engagements that nullified its advantages. Units accustomed to sweeping breakthroughs were forced into bitter combat for stairwells, factory floors, and bombed-out courtyards. Every captured position cost significant casualties, and each gain seemed smaller than the last. Meanwhile, the Red Army exploited the terrain with remarkable discipline. Zhukov's soldiers attacked at dawn, dusk, and under cover of darkness, using the familiar ruins to their advantage. They made the Germans pay for every meter of ground. Soviet snipers, most famously Vasily Zaitsev, transformed the city into a deadly labyrinth where every window could conceal an enemy marksman. All the while, the German High Command continued feeding fresh divisions into the center of the fight, instead of reinforcing the flanks. The tactical fixation on capturing the city blinded decision-makers to the broader operational picture. With so many units committed to urban combat, the Sixth Army lacked the reserves needed to respond. When the Soviets launched their counteroffensive, this tactical imbalance created the perfect conditions for encirclement. The Soviet Union's ability to conceal its preparations for Operation Uranus remains one of the most striking aspects of the Stalingrad campaign. Soviet intelligence, deception, and camouflage, collectively known as maskirovka, played a crucial role in misleading German analysts about the scale of the impending counterstrike. Interrogated prisoners, intercepted communications, and frontline observations all pointed toward significant Soviet reinforcements gathering north and south of the city. But within German headquarters, these warnings were interpreted through a lens of overconfidence. Many believed the Red Army was exhausted from months of attrition. They assumed that the bulk of Soviet strength was still tied down inside Stalingrad. even when aerial reconnaissance detected armored formations on the steppe. German analysts concluded they were meant to relieve the city, not launch a large-scale breakthrough. Moreover, the German reliance on Romanian and Italian forces to hold the flanks contributed to a critical blind spot. Reports from these Allied units describing Soviet buildups were often dismissed or minimized. The Germans believed the Soviets lacked the capability to mount an operation strong enough to break the Axis line. This failure to recognize the scale of the threat meant that when the Soviet offensive finally began, the Sixth Army was caught completely unprepared. The intelligence had been available, but it had not been fully believed, a misjudgment that paved the way to disaster. The leadership conflict, the tactical misalignment, and the intelligence blind spots were beginning to converge into a decision point that would define the battle's fate. Beneath the grand strategies and sweeping movements of armies, the Battle of Stalingrad unfolded on a deeply human scale. By October 1942, the soldiers of the German Sixth Army were physically and emotionally depleted. They had fought for months in scorching summer heat, choking autumn dust, and now the onset of bitter winter. Their uniforms, designed for fast campaigns, offered little protection against temperatures that frequently plunged below freezing. Inside the ruins, soldiers survived on meager rations. A day's meal might consist of a single piece of bread and a thin soup made from whatever could be scavenged. Water often came from melting snow. Sleep was scarce, interrupted by constant shelling and the fear of Soviet night patrols slipping through the rubble. Asterisk across the shattered streets, Soviet soldiers endured conditions just as harsh. Many fought mere meters from where they lived as civilians before the war. For them, the defense of Stalingrad carried a personal dimension. Zhukov's men fought with the grim determination of those defending their homes, families, and futures. They were reinforced by a steady stream of conscripts crossing the Volga under fire, their faces still young, their hands shaking in the cold. Civilians trapped inside the city suffered in silence. Many lived in basements filled with smoke and dust, emerging only when the fighting shifted away from their streets. Their presence added a desperate weight to the struggle. For Soviet defenders, the knowledge that families remained hidden nearby strengthened their resolve to hold each position. As human endurance strained under the brutality of urban warfare, the emotional and physical collapse of the Sixth Army accelerated. And as morale weakened, the effects of strategic misjudgment became even more severe. No army can fight without supplies. And by late 1942, the German Sixth Army sat at the edge of logistical collapse. Their supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers across hostile terrain, vulnerable to weather, partisan attacks, and growing Soviet pressure. Fuel shortages plagued armored units and transport vehicles, forcing commanders to ration every liter. Ammunition stocks dwindled, challenging even basic defensive operations. Despite this growing crisis, Hitler remained convinced that Stalingrad could be held. When encirclement became a possibility, Luftwaffe Chief Erman Gring assured him that the Sixth Army could be sustained entirely by air supply, an assertion rooted more in pride than in capability. In reality, the Luftwaffe lacked the necessary transport aircraft, fuel, and weather conditions to fulfill such a promise. At full efficiency, they would have needed to deliver hundreds of tons of supplies each day. They rarely managed a fraction of that. This logistical impossibility lay at the heart of the fatal decision. Without realistic support, the Sixth Army could not maintain its positions. Yet Hitler refused withdrawal, insisting that the city must remain in German hands. His reliance on air supply created the illusion of sustainability, undermining any chance of a breakout while escape was still possible. As the Soviets massed for their counteroffensive, the shrinking supplies ensured that when the moment of crisis arrived, the Sixth Army would be too weak to respond effectively. On the Soviet side, Commanders Zhukov and Vasilevsky were constructing a plan designed to exploit every German weakness. They had studied the enemy's patterns, the fixation on Stalingrad, the depletion of German manpower inside the city, the overextension of supply lines, and most critically, the vulnerable flanks held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces. Operation Uranus was a masterstroke of operational planning. Rather than attack the strongest German positions inside Stalingrad, the Soviets aimed for the weaker Axis allies guarding the northwestern and southeastern approaches. These units lacked sufficient anti-tank defenses and heavy artillery. Many soldiers were poorly equipped for the brutal winter. Soviet forces, by contrast, included well-supplied armored corps, cavalry, and infantry divisions prepared for deep penetration maneuvers. Once the breakthrough occurred, their objective was clear: drive rapidly toward Kalik, cut the German supply lines, and encircle the Sixth Army completely. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became the place where they would prove their ability not only to resist, but to counterattack on a massive scale. Their determination and organizational discipline stood in stark contrast to the increasingly chaotic German command structure. As these angles converged, the fate of the Sixth Army hung on a single point, the decision that would determine whether they lived or died inside the ruins of Stalingrad. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the steppe north of Stalingrad trembled beneath the weight of massed Soviet artillery. At 7:30 a.m., a deafening barrage shattered the frozen landscape, signaling the start of Operation Uranus. Snow swirled through the smoke as entire lines of Romanian positions, thinly manned, poorly armed, and stretched to the breaking point, buckled under the force of the assault. Within hours, Soviet infantry and armor surged forward, exploiting gaps that widened with every retreating Romanian unit. For the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad, the first reports arriving at headquarters seemed alarming but not yet catastrophic. Paulus and his staff understood that the flanks were vulnerable, but they believed the Romanian defenses would hold long enough for German reserves to respond. What they did not realize was that the reserves no longer existed in sufficient strength. Most had been fed into the city's endless urban combat, and the Soviets were committing far more troops to this offensive than German intelligence had ever anticipated. As Soviet tank columns pushed deeper into the Romanian rear, panic spread across the Axis lines. Units broke apart, retreating in disorganized masses as T-34s rolled through snow-covered trenches and open fields. Communications faltered. German liaison officers sent increasingly desperate messages warning that the front was collapsing. By the evening of November 20th, only one conclusion remained possible: the Soviets had achieved a decisive breakthrough. Inside Stalingrad, the mood shifted from confidence to dread. Paulus convened emergency meetings, reviewing rapidly worsening intelligence. Reports confirmed that Soviet forces were advancing toward Kalik, the key crossing point over the Don River and the lifeline of the Sixth Army. If Kalik fell, the army would be cut off. Paulus understood the gravity of the situation. A withdrawal, even a partial one, could still allow the Sixth Army to escape the tightening Soviet encirclement. His generals urged action. Many argued that the army should pull back immediately, abandoning the city to avoid being trapped. They were still mobile enough to break out while Soviet forces were stretched and consolidating their gains. But the authority to order such a maneuver did not lie with Paulus. He radioed Army Group Don and Hitler's headquarters, explaining that the flanks were collapsing and a breakout was essential. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute: the Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be held. To Hitler, retreat from Stalingrad represented defeat not just militarily, but symbolically. He rejected all suggestions of withdrawal and insisted that reinforcements were on the way. He assured Paulus that the Luftwaffe could supply the army by air. Paulus, bound by obedience and an ingrained sense of duty, accepted this decision despite his misgivings. Meanwhile, the Soviets pressed their advantage. On November 21st, the southern pincer of Operation Uranus broke through Romanian defenses and turned northward, racing to link up with the northern thrust. Soviet commanders coordinated their movements with precision, ensuring that both wings advanced at nearly equal speed. The encirclement trap was closing. On November 23, 1942, at approximately 4 p.m., Soviet tank units from the northern and southern fronts met near the town of Kalik, cutting the last major supply route. The German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was sealed inside Stalingrad. The Kessel, or cauldron, had formed. Paulus received word of the encirclement with a heavy silence that settled over the command bunker like a shroud. The moment had arrived when independent action might still have saved tens of thousands of lives. The Sixth Army could attempt a breakout immediately, while fuel and ammunition still existed in usable quantities, but Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Stand fast. Supplies will be flown in. Relief will come. Paulus hesitated, torn between military necessity and absolute obedience to the Führer. That hesitation, that single moment of compliance in the face of disaster, transformed a desperate situation into an irreversible catastrophe. The fatal decision had been made, and now the consequences began to unfold inside the newly formed Kessel. The reality of encirclement settled in quickly. German officers studied maps illuminated by dim lanterns, tracing the shrinking perimeter with trembling fingers. Ammunition stocks were low, fuel reserves dangerously depleted, and winter temperatures were falling fast. Yet the Sixth Army still possessed enough strength to attempt a breakout. If the order were given immediately, Paulus' staff urged action. Generals such as Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach argued passionately that remaining in Stalingrad meant certain destruction. Their armored units, though battered, still had mobility. Their infantry divisions, though weakened, remained organized. The Soviets were still stabilizing their newly formed ring and had not yet sealed every gap. It was the moment to strike, but the authority to decide did not rest with Paulus, and Hitler's voice reached Stalingrad with cold finality. The Sixth Army will not retreat. It will hold its positions and await relief. This was the decision that would lose the battle. Hitler believed that holding Stalingrad would anchor the entire southern front. He rejected the idea of ceding ground, insisting that a breakout would create panic and unravel German plans across the region. His refusal to consider tactical withdrawal echoed previous victories where stubborn defense had paid off. But Stalingrad was no longer a place for such illusions. Meanwhile, to justify his command, Hitler placed immense faith in the Luftwaffe's ability to resupply the encircled army. Göring had promised that the Air Force could deliver at least 300 tons of supplies per day. He spoke with confidence, without consulting logistics officers or assessing winter weather patterns over the steppe. In truth, the airlift had no chance of meeting the Sixth Army's needs. Even in ideal conditions, the Luftwaffe lacked the aircraft and fuel required. And the conditions at Stalingrad were far from ideal. As Paulus awaited resupply that would never come. Another force was moving toward the Kessel, Army Group Dohn, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His mission, Operation Winter Storm, was to break through Soviet lines and restore contact with Stalingrad. Manstein, one of Germany's most capable strategists, believed the Sixth Army should attempt a simultaneous breakout to meet his advancing forces halfway. Only combined movement, he argued, could overcome Soviet resistance. On December 12, 1942, Manstein launched his relief effort. His spearhead units fought their way across frozen rivers and snow-covered plains, closing the distance to Stalingrad with impressive speed. Within days, forward elements were less than 50 kilometers from the encircled army, a distance that could have been bridged by a determined breakout. Inside the Kessel, Officers listened to radio reports of Manstein's advance with renewed hope. This was their chance. If Paulus acted decisively, thousands could still escape the trap. German tanks were refueled for a potential breakout. Infantry units prepared for movement. The troops sensed the possibility of survival. But when Paulus requested permission to join Manstein's thrust, Hitler refused. He insisted the Sixth Army remain in Stalingrad, claiming that abandoning the city would undo everything they had fought to achieve. He believed Manstein could break through alone. He believed the airlift would continue. He believed the Sixth Army could endure. Belief began to replace reality as the guiding principle of German strategy. Manstein pressed for Paulus to act independently, hinting that Hitler's orders should be interpreted with flexibility. But Paulus, whose entire career had been built on discipline and adherence to command hierarchy, could not bring himself to defy the Führer. He hesitated, waiting for authority that would never come. By late December, Manstein's offensive stalled under the weight of Soviet resistance. The Red Army had anticipated the relief attempt and shifted reserves to block it. As Soviet counterattacks intensified, Manstein reluctantly pulled back. The window for breakout closed. The Sixth Army was now fully isolated, with no possibility of external rescue. Inside Stalingrad, conditions deteriorated with shocking speed. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Horses, once used for transport, were slaughtered for food. Soldiers burned furniture and doors to stay warm. Wounded men froze to death in unheated shelters. Ammunition became so scarce that units could not respond to Soviet assaults. Radios crackled with desperate calls for supplies. But the airlift faltered under relentless Soviet fire and winter storms. The decision to hold Stalingrad had now transformed into a sentence. By January 1943, Soviet forces began their final offensive to crush the remaining German resistance. They advanced systematically, dividing the Kessel into smaller pockets. Paulus, trapped in the city center, watched the map of his command shrink day by day. His divisions could no longer maneuver. His men could no longer fight. The army that had once struck fear across continents had been reduced to starving. Clusters of frostbitten survivors, the decisive moment. Hitler's refusal to allow a breakout had sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, and now the consequences of that choice were unfolding with brutal clarity. By the beginning of January 1943, the encircled Sixth Army had become a shadow of the force that once spearheaded Germany's advance into southern Russia. Inside the frozen Kessel, starvation hollowed the faces of soldiers who had once marched confidently across the steppe. Their boots were worn thin, their gloves improvised from torn blankets and scraps of uniform. Many no longer had the strength to stand for long periods. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Disease spread through crowded bunkers where wounded men lay side by side without medicine, heat, or hope. The Luftwaffe's airlift, which Hitler had promised would sustain the army, had long since failed. Blizzards grounded aircraft for days at a time. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft batteries turned the skies into killing grounds. Even when transport planes broke through, they delivered only a fraction of what was needed. Some sorties arrived with empty cargo holds because supplies had been loaded improperly or lost in transit. Meanwhile, the wounded waited for evacuation flights that rarely came. Many died before ever seeing an aircraft land. Food rations dwindled to almost nothing. Soldiers boiled leather straps to create a bitter broth. Some dug through abandoned Soviet positions in search of frozen potatoes or scraps of bread. The horses that had survived the initial weeks of encirclement were consumed one by one. Even then, hunger grew relentless. Men collapsed during guard duty. Entire units faded away as attrition claimed them without a single shot fired. As the Soviets tightened their grip, Paulus attempted to reorganize his forces into smaller defensive zones. But communication lines failed, and divisions that once held thousands of men could muster only a few hundred each. Ammunition shortages were so severe that some positions could not return fire during Soviet attacks. Artillery pieces stood silent, their crews too weak to operate them. On January 10, 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final assault on the shrinking German pocket. Soviet artillery unleashed a barrage that shook the ground for miles. Then infantry and tanks advanced in coordinated waves, slicing through weakened German positions. Every day, the Kessel grew smaller. German commanders sent urgent messages to Paulus describing catastrophic losses, collapsing defenses, and fields littered with the dead. Soviet soldiers advancing through the ruins found scenes of almost unimaginable suffering. Abandoned trenches filled with frozen corpses. Hospital bunkers where wounded men lay unattended. Shelters where starving survivors huddled silently, too weak to speak. The once formidable Sixth Army had become a trapped mass of broken humanity. Hitler responded not with compassion or realism, but with another symbolic gesture. On January 30, 1943, he promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered while holding command. The implication was unmistakable. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or take his own life, rather than capitulate, but Paulus did neither. He had watched too many of his men die under impossible circumstances. His staff pleaded for surrender. They understood the battle was lost, the army destroyed, the suffering unbearable. Paulus faced a decision that could no longer be postponed. On January 31, 1943, Soviet troops reached the command post in the basement of a bombed-out department store. Paulus allowed himself to be taken prisoner. He became the first field marshal in German history to surrender. While isolated pockets fought on for 2 more days, the battle was effectively over. And as the surviving German soldiers emerged from the ruins with hands raised, the full scale of the disaster became clear. Over 90,000 men surrendered. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The decision not to retreat had condemned nearly an entire army. The fall of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was more than a battlefield defeat. It was a strategic and psychological earthquake that reshaped the entire course of the Second World War. For Germany, the loss reverberated far beyond the frozen ruins of the city. An entire field army, one of the most experienced and well-equipped formations in the Wehrmacht, had been destroyed not by maneuver or chance, but by a decision rooted in pride, miscalculation, and a refusal to trust operational reality. In the weeks following the surrender, Soviet propaganda celebrated Stalingrad as a turning point, a demonstration that the Red Army could not only withstand the German war machine, but defeat it decisively. Across the world, newspapers featured headlines proclaiming Hitler's greatest defeat. The aura of German invincibility, which had shaped the war's early years, began to fade. The impact on Axis allies was profound. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, which had suffered heavy losses during the Soviet encirclement and in the battles that followed, became increasingly reluctant to continue fighting in support of German objectives. Their trust in German strategic leadership eroded. Many leaders questioned how they could continue to commit forces when Germany had failed to protect them at Stalingrad and had sacrificed its own army through rigid command. Inside Germany, shock settled into the German public consciousness. Radio broadcasts downplayed the scale of the loss, but even sanitized reports could not hide the truth. Families received terse notices that sons, husbands, and fathers were missing in the East. Churches filled with mourners. Factories and farms felt the absence of men who would never return. The defeat at Stalingrad began to unravel the sense of inevitability that had sustained German morale in the early war years. Within the Wehrmacht, officers reevaluated the command structure that had led to such disaster. Many saw in Stalingrad the consequences of a system that demanded absolute obedience, discouraged initiative, and concentrated authority in the hands of a leader who refused to accept unfavorable realities. Whispered criticisms grew louder in private conversations. The seeds of doubt, once planted, spread through the ranks. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad brought both relief and rebirth. Red Army morale soared. Commanders like Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Chukov emerged as national heroes. The Soviet government celebrated the battle as proof that the tide of war had turned. And in many ways it had. The victory opened the path for successive offensives that would push the Axis forces westward throughout 1943 and 1944. Materially, the destruction of the Sixth Army meant that Germany could no longer maintain its extended position in the southern Soviet Union. The entire front began to contract. The Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive posture it would never again fully abandon. While battles still raged across the Eastern Front, the strategic initiative had permanently shifted to the Soviet Union. The human cost remained staggering. Of the 250,000 soldiers who had been trapped in the Kessel, only a small fraction survived captivity. Soviet reports described tens of thousands dying from starvation, disease, and exhaustion during the march to prisoner camps. Many never made it out of the ruins. Stalingrad became not only a symbol of Soviet resilience, but a graveyard for an entire generation of German soldiers. Yet the tragedy of Stalingrad was not confined to numbers or military charts. Its legacy rested in the understanding that one decision, Hitler's refusal to allow a breakout, combined with Paulus' inability to defy those orders, had sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. The battle demonstrated the catastrophic consequences when ideology overrides strategy, when obedience replaces judgment, and when leaders prioritize symbolism over survival. As Europe watched the consequences unfold, Stalingrad became the dividing line between German expansion and German retreat. Story now shifts from the immediate aftermath to the broader meaning of Stalingrad in the history of warfare. In the quiet that followed the battle, long after the guns had fallen silent and the snow had buried the wreckage, Stalingrad remained a stark reminder of the cost of inflexible command. The ruins of the city stood as monuments to a clash of wills, one shaped by ideology, the other by necessity. For the men who fought and died there, the decisions made far from the front determined their fate more than their own courage or skill. History often turns on single moments. And at Stalingrad, that moment was defined by refusal. Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat, and Paulus' refusal to defy him. Between those two decisions lay the destruction of an entire army. The Sixth Army fought with discipline, endurance, and resilience, but no amount of bravery could overcome a strategy that denied reality. Their sacrifice became a lesson written not in doctrine, but in human lives. Stalingrad was more than a military turning point. It marked the end of German momentum on the Eastern Front and the rebirth of Soviet confidence. It revealed the limits of authoritarian command and the dangers of leadership isolated from the battlefield's truth. In its aftermath, armies around the world studied the battle for its operational lessons. Yet the deeper message endured. Flexibility in command is not a luxury, it is a necessity. For the survivors, Stalingrad was a memory carried across decades, a wound that never fully healed. For nations, it reshaped the trajectory of the war and altered the balance of global power. And for history, it stood as a reminder that pride, when elevated above judgment, can destroy even the strongest of forces. The decision that lost the Battle of Stalingrad was not made in the trenches or on the factory floors of the city. It was made in the quiet of distant headquarters, where one man's will outweighed the desperate reality on the ground. And in that contrast between ideology and survival, between command and consequence, Stalingrad found its place as one of the defining tragedies of the Second World War.